scientific fact, like the air we breathe, like gravity.
Oh, okay. Don't get me started on gravity.
Now, are you telling me that you are so unbelievably arrogant that you can't admit that there's a teeny tiny possibility that you could be wrong about this?
There might be a teeny tiny possibility.
So, you know, to me it seems Einstein birthed sort of this new modern era of scientific pontification where the masses, and even those considered as scientists, mathematicians, etc., just simply jumped on board with this, you know, relativity theory. And frankly, they jumped on board with it because that's what everyone else was doing. That's what the media and the government told them to do. And frankly, they didn't get it, so they didn't want to look stupid, right? I mean, it's just crazy when you look at all this, but you know, the proof's been there. I mean, the proof has been there for over a century, right? How long? When was the Aries failure? That was the first of these, wasn't it?
Yeah, Aries failure was done a long, long time ago. It was all the way back in I have it written down here, 1871.
And then 87 was Michelson-Morley. And, you know, John, what you said was perfect too, but the one thing that's crazy about it is you talked about Einstein basically doing away with the ether. He did away with the ether that they just proved. That is the craziest thing of the whole story.
I mean, wouldn't it be nice to have that sort of latitude? Just do away with it.
Right, it was proven experimentally. It's proven, and then he came along and said, well, no, it's not. We're going to use these equations, which are going to explain away what you guys thought was happening, when clearly it was just proven.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly true. And so, yeah, so there's your problem with that is when the parameters of the test or the results of the test don't come out, they just change everything. And then act like, you know, oh, well, yeah, that's the way it should have been all along. And of course, since then, so many modern day physicists, not just us crazy flat earthers, but so many mainstream physicists, engineers, scientists have looked at Einstein's theory of relativity and special relativity, and it's been debunked 1,000 times over because it's utterly ridiculous.
Well, it's not so much that, you know, like I don't believe in it. You know, it's just, I don't know, lately I get the feeling that I'm not so much being pulled down as I am being pushed.
Uh-oh, it's Isaac Newton and he's pissed.
Has there ever been an experiment done to prove that the Earth is revolving around the sun?
Yes, there was several experiments in the 1800s. Dominique Arago, Armand Fuseau, Augustin Fresnel, but one of the most famous was the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887.
Let's assume the ether frame moves relative to the Earth from left to right. Michelson-Morley used a half-silvered mirror to split a beam of light so that it travels in two different directions along two paths of equal length. This is the light beam before it is split. Moving in a perpendicular direction to the ether frame, this beam would be blown off course and would have to travel a little further. Traveling back down this path again, perpendicular to the ether, would also move this beam off course, if the ether existed. This beam, moving parallel to the ether and in the same direction, would increase its speed. This beam, again parallel to the ether, but moving in the opposite direction, would be slowed down. Here the two light beams are recombined together, and if they are in phase, they will constructively interfere. But if the speed was different in the two paths, they would combine to give an interference pattern.
No. Tell us about that.
Well, they used light beams to measure whether the Earth was moving, and they found that there was no movement. The Earth has to be moving 30 kilometers per second to complete its annual revolution, and they found out that it wasn't moving in a very precise. Michelson could have calculated it to 1/100th of what he got in his experiment. That's how sensitive his instruments were.
What did the experiment involve in terms of apparatus, so we can get a concrete understanding of
well,
what they found?
If the Earth is moving around the sun, and we shoot that light beam in the direction that the Earth is moving, okay, and then we shoot another light beam perpendicular to that, Well, the one that's in the direction of the Earth's movement should be impeded in some way if it's moving through space, whereas this one that's going perpendicular would not be impeded.
Why not?
Because it's not going through space. It's just going north and south.
Okay.
Okay? And what they found, they expected to have a 30-kilometer difference between these two light beams. There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Born admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity. And now you say, well, the reason that light beam wasn't affected when it went toward the motion of the Earth is because the apparatus shortened.
Huh?
Yeah, Michelson's apparatus shortened as it was going with the Earth in its orbit around the sun.
No, wait, you're telling me that the contraction of mass
Yes.
was invented to explain away the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment?
Yes, and that's what my book will tell you, and it's been admitted by all the scientists.
Well, isn't there any experimental confirmation that as you approach the speed of light, there's a contraction effect? The impression is that there's all kinds of experimental confirmation.
That was invented. There's no proof to it.
Really?
Yes, all the physicists will tell you there's no proof
Not
to
that
it.
I'm surprised, you understand.
Yeah.
I know what the scientific community is capable of in terms of mass deception. Evolution is a mass deception. But I wasn't aware that they don't really have any even purported scientific confirmation in terms of physical measurement.
No, nobody
of the contraction effect.
Nobody measured a contraction. But they put it into a mathematical formula called the Lorentz transform, and it's probably the most famous equation used in physics today.
Does anyone expressly admit that, hey, we had to come up with this contraction effect because otherwise we're stuck with a motionless
Yes,
Earth?
the very guy who invented it.
Tell me what he
Lorentz.
admitted.
Heinrich Lorentz says, I don't have any other explanation to this experiment of Michelson-Morley unless I contract the apparatus. Otherwise, we're going to have to believe the Earth is standing still in space.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Can you give an approximate page reference for me to your book? I want to go back and read that right away.
I'll send you an email. I'll show you where it is.
If a telescope is pointing at a star, and both are stationary, then obviously the light comes straight into the telescope. In 1729, Bradley found that he had to tip his telescope forward very slightly to get a star in the center of his telescope. It was assumed that this was due to the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Let us assume that the telescope was moving at 5 miles an hour and had to be tipped 5 degrees. This 5-degree tipping, however, could equally be caused by the ether moving at 5 miles an hour, carrying the stars around the Earth. As we see here, the light would be coming in at the same angle, and the telescope would still have to be tipped 5 degrees. So tipping the telescope does not tell us whether it is the starlight moving or the telescope moving. However, there is a simple experiment that can determine whether it was the Earth that was moving or the ether and starlight. All that you had to do was record the tipping required for any particular star, then fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the speed of light in the telescope. So here is the moving telescope filled with water, tipped at 5 degrees, and you can see that the starlight does not now reach the eyepiece at the bottom. This is because the starlight moves much more slowly when passing through water. However, if the telescope is tipped further, say 10 degrees, then the starlight will then be visible again in the eyepiece. It has to be tipped further because the light is now slower when in the telescope. But if the starlight is going past the telescope at 5 miles an hour, then when it is filled with water, no further tipping is needed because the light is coming in at 5 degrees anyway. The starlight stays on the same path but is only travelling slower in the water. To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further.
Here's another objection. If everything is moving, in other words, all the stars in the universe are moving, how could we possibly determine if we are the center of this moving universe?
Over the past decade or so, we have seen out to the very limits of the observable cosmos. We've mapped its largest structure, the cosmic microwave background, the oldest light in the universe according to the standard Big Bang model of cosmology. What we have discovered is shocking.
On the very largest scales, we see a pattern of really big hot and cold spots which line up around a special axis, which has been dubbed the axis of evil. And it's quite puzzling. Why is there a special direction in space?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you asked that, because in 2009 they set up a probe called the Planck probe. It just came back with the results in 2013 in March. I don't know if you heard about it or not.
No.
The European Space Agency set it up in cooperation with NASA. This was the third attempt that they had to nullify the data that they were finding in the cosmic microwave background radiation that permeates the whole universe, that the Earth was in the center of the universe. The first one they set up was in 1990 called the COBE probe. It came back, showed the Earth was in the center. The WMAP was the second one in 2001, came back with the same data. And what they tried to do was say that this was all an error. It was some kind of misreading, or it was there was contamination in the apparatus or the sky or whatever. So they sent up a third probe in 2009, just came back in 2013. Guess what? Same exact results. Same exact results. And what were the interpretations? Well, the Earth has to be in the center of the universe. And we have somebody quoted in our book, Lawrence Krauss of the Arizona State University, who says, yeah, this means we're in the center of the universe.
Let's pick up on that point a bit. You mentioned that the background radiation, microwave radiation in the universe, supplied data from which it became apparent that the Earth was in fact at the center of a moving universe. Explain why that is so. Why do these data confirm that?
Okay. Well, the Big Bang Theory predicts that there was an explosion 13.7 billion years ago. Okay? So if there was an explosion, then that means the explosion had to come out equal on all sides of the sphere. It had to be what they call homogeneous. Okay? And that's naturally accepted. It's like homogenized milk.
Sure.
You know, you shake that thing up and you can't see one place from another place. It's all homogenized. And that's what they needed for this Big Bang universe. What they found when they sent these three probes up, yeah, some of it was homogeneous, but it's like having a bowl full of Jell-O with two swords going through the middle of the Jell-O.
What are the swords?
The swords are the orientation of the cosmic microwave background radiation throughout the universe.
What do you mean by the orientation?
Okay, there's hot and cold spots they found. It's not homogeneous. There's hot and cold spots in this microwave background radiation, and if you align all these cold spots, it forms an X through the whole universe.
Unbelievable.
And guess what's in the middle?
Oh, you're kidding.
No.
This is what the data shows.
This is what the data shows.
Okay, come on now. What mainstream publication recognizes
The
this?
University of Michigan, Dragon Hutterer, Craig Copey, Glenn Starkman. These are all the guys who have done all the work on this microwave radiation. They write it in their papers. They wrote one in 2004, 2008, 2010, and 2012, and they're writing another one on the Planck probe.
So you're saying these space probes were designed to explain away the X represented by the hot and cold spots?
They wanted to make sure it wasn't an accident.
Okay, so there were how many probes in total?
3 in 20 years.
And you're saying that all 3 confirmed what then?
That the Earth is in the center of the universe.
On the basis of the hot and cold spots?
Yes.
Whose alignment represents an X.
An X.
And at the center of the X is the Earth.
Right, and they call that X the axis of evil. That was coined.
Scientists call that the axis of evil.
Called it the axis of evil. That was coined in 2004 when Bush went into Iraq. Remember, he called them the axis of evil? So this cosmologist just picked it up and said, yeah, well, here's the axis of evil right here in the universe.
So, in other words, they're enraged by the finding.
Oh, yeah.
Because it upsets their worldview, which
Yeah.
has to displace the Earth's special position in the universe.
Yeah.
Which fits in rather nicely with a divinely created universe.
Right.
Made for man.
All of cosmology is based on what we call the Copernican principle. Every piece of data that they get in their telescope has to be filtered through the Copernican principle. And that's what the Big Bang Theory does, NASA does it, ESA does it, everybody does it. The upsetting thing about this microwave radiation is it just totally defies the Copernican principle.
The last probe confirmed that as well, you say?
The last probe, yeah. As a matter of fact,
where was that result reported? Obviously everywhere, but give me some examples.
March 21st in the European Space Agency report. As a matter of fact, it's in our movie.
What's their attempt to explain the latest probe's findings away?
Anomalies.
Anomalies? Mm-hmm. And all the anomalies conveniently line up in a non-anomalous way to verify their model.
Right.
This is amazing. So this brings us to the question of motive. We've been hinting at it throughout the discussion. There's obviously a motive at work here. Many people have recognized, not just believers, not just Catholics, but people like David Berlinski, for example, that science has become an ideology. Maybe you could take up that theme as we close out this interview.
Yeah.
Isn't there an ideological component?
Yeah, I would even go so far as to say it's a religion. Science is a religion today. It's scientism. And they've already got the parameters within which they want to interpret the data. And they're not going to go outside those parameters. This is a perfect example. You do get some of them that break out of it, and they say, yeah, well, this defies the Copernican principle. We've read many papers like that, and we quote them in our book. Okay? But the motivation is, if the Copernican principle is wrong, that means all of science is wrong. Everything, cosmogony, paleontology, cosmology, archaeology, everything now becomes suspect because we can't support these long ages. We can't support this vast universe. As a matter of fact, we're in the center of it. How does that happen? Well, it's not going to happen by chance. Someone had to put it there, you see, and that's what they're scared of. That's the motivation.
And we have to say, yes, we have to say, no experiment can detect absolute motion. All physics can do is describe relative motion. And Einstein even says, it's a quote in our book, it is equally valid under relativity to talk about the Earth motionless at the center and the universe rotating around it, or the Earth rotating on its axis and the universe being steady.
Okay, Phoebe, this is it. In this briefcase, I carry actual scientific facts. A briefcase of facts, if you will.
Okay, I'm just saying that it's one of the possibilities.
It's the only possibility, Phoebe.
Okay. Ross, could you just open your mind like this much? Okay? Now, wasn't there a time when the brightest minds in the world believed that the Earth was flat?
You gotta listen. Try to listen closely. Keep in mind the details are pretty technical. I will try to dumb it down if I can. So, the ADIRU system, also known as the Air Data Initial Reference Unit, we pronounce it IDARU. Oof, it's a horrible name, but I'll keep trying. IDARU is the standard in modern avionics. It's at the center of a modern aircraft's avionics system. This has been the case for some 20-odd years and has replaced the old inertia navigation system, otherwise known as the INS, which was a standalone reference for the navigation computer. IDARU offers 1. Ring laser gyros. No more mechanical spinning discs on gimbals. The RLG are on a tethered or strapped down platform. Ring laser gyros. 2, the integration with other systems. IDARU provides a reference for other systems like the ADIs, weather radar, yaw damper, thrust control, etc. It used to be the case that all of these systems were independently referenced with dedicated gyros. And 3, much greater processing power. Whenever IDARU is started up, it needs to be initialized or aligned. This is where the system calibrates itself to the spin of the Earth to prevent drift. The procedure involves entering your latitude and longitude coordinates and commanding the initialization. During initialization, no systems that reference it can be on, and the aircraft must be stationary and stable. Even loading luggage or catering supplies can disrupt it and cause an error. This takes from between 5 to 17 minutes, depending on how far from the equator you are. And by the way, as I was reading this the first time, I thought for a while there he was going to be, a pilot, finally a professional that comes out against flat Earth. But that's not where he's going with this. So bear with me, all right? Now the story, if you're still awake. In October of 2015, I was commanding a routine 6-hour flight. When it came to initializing the IDA-RU, it returned an error. This is not all that uncommon, and it usually takes on a second attempt. After a few tries, we just got the same thing, error. I called the tower, explained the situation, and they sent an avionics tech out. He ran his check in the avionics bay and said that it all checked out and that the fault was only with the initialization module inside the box. In this situation, they would normally just unplug it and slide a replacement box in there. However, it's a rare occurrence and has never happened to me. Unfortunately, there was no replacement available at this location. I called the company and reported the situation. After about 20 minutes, someone got back to me and advised that they could get a replacement box to me, but would take about 12 hours. Or, since my flight plan was not outside of ground radar coverage, I could use GPS as a primary reference and adjust the IDA-RU data via ATC manually and periodically to compensate for drift. I decided that the later suggestion was within safe limits and made the decision to continue. As instructed, I had my first officer regularly call ATC for ground radar positioning and make necessary adjustments to the IDA-RU data. However, throughout the entire flight, this was a 6-hour flight, no drift occurred. This was a real head-scratcher, and since it's company policy and my personal policy to understand as much as possible about the aircraft and its systems, I wanted to know why. I talked to someone at our fleet maintenance department and was told that they didn't make repairs to any black boxes, and I should talk to the manufacturer, in this case, Honeywell. I contacted Honeywell and managed to talk to a senior IDA-RU engineer. He was very helpful. It turns out they don't make the ACM, or the alignment calibration module, which looks a bit like a desktop PC hard drive painted bright orange with warnings printed on it, do not open, serviceable only by manufacturer. It turns out that there's only one company that supplies these modules to all avionics makers, and nobody else seems to know anything about their workings. I tried contacting the company and was just given the runaround. This is very strange since pilots are usually welcome anywhere in the industry. I could show up unannounced at Boeing and get treated like family. After a lot of digging, I found out that this mysterious ACM manufacturer is a contractor to NASA, and that's all I can find out. To date, I've been unable to talk to anyone there and still can't find out anything about this ACM. It feels like I've hit a wall, but I'm still digging. To be fair, I wouldn't describe myself as a flat earther. I'm just someone who wants this question answered. If there are any breakthroughs on this, I'll let you know. Feel free to use any of this on your show, but please remember to refer to me as Mac. I did consider allowing you to interview me, but this time I don't think I'm comfortable with that. I'll let you know if I change my mind. All the best, Mac. Wow. Okay, so let me break that down for you real quick. So inside the gyro system that he was talking about, the gyro system, in this case, the black box, was made by Honeywell. The alignment calibration module is not made by Honeywell. It's subcontracted out by another company, and that company has it sealed to where only they are allowed to work on it, but they don't ever work on it. They just swap them out. They just swap out the parts. So what happened was this particular alignment module broke before he could fly. The weird, on the weird circumstance, they couldn't get a new one in there, so he flew the 6 hours without using it. And the plane should have drifted because of the curvature and the Coriolis effect, otherwise known as the spinning of the Earth. And it didn't. The plane didn't drift for 6 hours on a 777. That's a flagship, top of the line stuff there. Why didn't it drift? And he was trying to figure out why. He couldn't figure it out. And in the process of trying to figure out what happened, he discovered that this module, this module is made by exactly one company, and they supply every airline in the industry. And when you try to call them, they don't talk to you. And they're a subcontractor for NASA. Remember what I said about If you want to plug the holes, you want to do it very securely, when it comes to hiding things, and this would be that thing. So to keep the pilots from not worrying about it, you tell them there's a guidance system inside their plane that accounts for the curvature and the spinning of the Earth, and it doesn't. And you hope to God something like this doesn't happen, to where it breaks, and the pilot goes, well, wait a minute, how am I flying normally without that thing working? Why have that thing in there at all? And when you call the company to figure out what they're actually doing, they won't talk to you. That's brilliant.
Here it is, gyroscopes. Prove unequivocally, beyond any doubt whatsoever, two things actually. One, that there is no curvature of the Earth, and two, that there is no motion to the Earth. Now, I'm all ready for all of the backlash and all the stuff like that. And in fact, one of the first people I'm going to go on is there is this wonderful video done in total ignorance by Lord Stephen Christ, who comes on and he says, well, got news for you guys. Gyroscopes have this thing called Schuler tuning on them. And it is because of this Schuler tuning that it proves beyond any doubt whatsoever that the Earth is, of course, concave. That would be his take on it. Not only does it not prove that it's not concave, it also proves that it's not convex either. Because Stephen Christ, for being the imaginative lord that he is, obviously has never bothered to read any further about what Schuler tuning actually is and how it is actually applied. I'm going to explain that and elaborate a little bit on this for you guys so that we can kind of dispel the Schuler tuning myth. Now, I did cover this 2 or 3 weeks ago already. Granted, I had never heard of it before. Even being a pilot for 35 years, I had never heard of it before. Even working in radio shops, right along people that had airframe and power plant licenses that were working on avionics and aircraft radio, still never had come across it. Why? Because it's basically a fantasy. Here's the deal with Schuler tuning. Schuler tuning describes a procedure to affect an inertial navigation system to compensate for a theoretical curvature of the Earth. Of all the navigation systems I have seen or asked others about that work in the industry, this modification seems to be conspicuously not used. Now, let's look at what Wiki says about Schuler tuning. So it says Schuler tuning is a modification to the electronic control system used in inertial navigation systems. Now this is important right here, and we'll address this in a second. That accounts for the curvature of the Earth. An inertial navigation system used in submarines, ships, aircraft, and other vehicles to keep track of position determines directions with respect to 3 axes pointing northeast and down. To detect a vehicle's orientation, the system contains an inertial platform mounted on gimbals with gyroscopes to keep it pointing in a fixed orientation in space. However, the directions northeast and down change as the vehicle moves on the curved surface of the Earth. Schuler tuning describes the modifications necessary to an inertial navigation system to keep the inertial platform always pointing northeast, south, down, yada, yada, yada. Okay, well, first of all, we have to look and say, okay, well, what's the inertial navigation system? So we look at that. So an INS is a navigation aid that uses a computer, first and foremost, and that is also huge. Motion sensors, accelerometers, and rotation sensors, gyroscopes, to continuously calculate via dead reckoning the position, orientation, and velocity of a moving object without the need for external references. Okay, so let me break this down and tell you what this is actually saying. So before I do that, let's jump over here to the other thing that it talked about, inertial platform, which is basically a gyroscopic platform or a stabilized platform using gyroscopes to maintain a platform in a fixed orientation in space, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but let's go back to this. So what they're talking about here is Schuler tuning is a system that describes modification to an inertial navigation system, which, first of all, an inertial navigation system, as we have already described, requires the use of a computer. Well, that, first of all, should raise a lot of red flags to anybody that was a pilot before 25 years ago, which would be me, and many, many other people on the Earth. And the reason being is because we were not using computers in our aircraft at that time or any time since the Wright brothers to compensate for the curvature of the Earth. It's utterly nonsense. So what it's doing, what they're saying is that this modification brought about by Schuler tuning, which is using a computer to affect a navigation system. Now, first of all, let me tell you what the navigation system is that they're describing. These navigation systems are not in use in most aircraft today. They are in use in a large amount of the airliners, but as far as to the total percentage of all aircraft on Earth, not even a drop in the bucket. So what this is saying is that the inertial navigation system, which would be a complete autopiloting system, which would allow you to take off, fly your route, do your landing, all that stuff, all by computer control automatically. It is the Schuler tuning that is a procedure that describes how to modify an already existing internal navigation system to compensate for the curvature of the Earth, whether it be from GPS data, which, by the way, is not existent for that particular function, or some other methodology, which there is another methodology, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the bottom line is it's talking about modifying an existing navigation system that would be of the high order of technology anyway that never even existed before 25, 30 years ago. So even if it were true, which it isn't, but even if it were true that it were modifying the orientation of the gyros to keep consistent so that the gyroscope is at a constant 90-degree angle perpendicular to the center point of the Earth, which would be directly below it, there is no way to necessarily do this. And I can tell you that all navigation equipment that most airplanes use, which is a gyroscope for your artificial horizon, for your turn and slip indicator, for your rate of climb, all of those are based on straight-up gyroscopes with absolutely no modification to them to change any orientation to the gyro itself to compensate for gravity or for the curvature of the Earth. Because the whole idea is to keep the gyroscope plane at a perfect 90-degree angle to the spot that's directly below you that goes all the way to the center of the Earth. So first of all, Schuler tuning is not even used in the majority of these systems. Now, another thing that they will talk about is there's another type of gyro that is fairly new, not hugely new, but that uses, instead of electric motors to power up the flywheel on the gyroscope, it uses vanes and air pressure. So another model that came up, and I was discussing this with Curious Life of a Flat Earther, that he caught a lot of rebuttal on, was these vanes that are supposedly in the bottom. Not supposedly, they actually are there, I will admit that, at the bottom of the gyroscopic structure that take the air that is blown across the vanes that spin the gyro, and according to gravity or the orientation of the plane, it will open one of 4 air gates to be able to discharge the air that is spinning up the gyro. Well, that's all great. Now, first of all, like I said, this is something that's relatively new. Before that, they simply used electric motors to spin up the gyros. However, there are magnetic fields and other things that can cause problems with that, even though they work well for the most part. This air drive is supposedly a better system, so great. But what they're saying then is that if you modify the aircraft, its trajectory or its angle, that what will happen is that the gyro will stay rigid in space, because that's what gyros do. They stay rigid in space no matter what the orientation of the plane is around it. But they're saying that when you go into like a 60-degree turn, for example, the gyroscope is going to stay rigid in space, but because the air vane that is discharging the air that is spinning up the gyro is kind of at the sump of the gyroscopic mechanism, that it will open one of 4 corresponding gates, you know, one for each direction, northeast, southwest, and it will kind of force the line of gravity so that the gyroscope goes back to a perfect 90-degree perpendicular line to an imaginary line that goes down to the center of the Earth. Well, first of all, that's silly, because if you could do that simply by blowing air across some sort of a gate, you've got to take into consideration a million other factors, like what is the resistance of that gate to the air? In other words, what if it's sticky? How much air is actually going across it? You have surface contacts. You have a million things that have to be taken into consideration. But as far as it making any type of precision adjustment, that's simply impossible. What it actually does, what these air gates actually do, is they act as a dampening system. There are two mechanisms in a gyro that prevents it from spinning around in circles, and that is if you're in an aerobatics plane and you do a roll or a loop or something like that, obviously the cage would be rotating all the way around the gyroscope, and it would cause everything to kind of run amok. But what they do is they put limits in on the gimbals that hold the gyroscope, so that once you go past 60 or 70 degrees, something like that, or maybe even more, there's a mechanical lock there that prevents it from going any further. Now, what the air pressure does going through those relief gates at the bottom, those discharge gates, is it acts more of a dampening mechanism so that you don't have such a wildly gyrating artificial horizon when you've come out of some sort of a high-speed maneuver that requires a lot of banking or hard turning or something like that. So the bottom line is that neither the air vanes at the bottom of the air-driven gyroscopes used to exist in the past. They were all motor-driven. And secondly, the computers to drive inertial navigation systems are only something that in the past few decades that have come about to even be able to allow an airplane to be computer-controlled. And so what happened to the 60 or 70 years before that when pilots were flying international flights, yada, yada, yada? In other words, the whole idea of the Schuler tuning of a navigation system that hasn't existed except for the last few decades is utter bullshit. So what gyroscopes really do is their claim to fame is they have a rigidity in space. Now, you can buy a gyroscope. People have used gyroscopes for years. They're toys. They also make extremely high-end gyroscopes that are precision machined that will run for a long, long time, 20, 30 minutes, on a spin. They also have them now where you can use little electric motors externally to spin them up to around 8,000 RPM. Well, this is something that was never done, that never able to be done, back in the days of antiquity when, for example, Foucault did his gyroscopic experiments. And Foucault is kind of credited for all of this, by the way. Not only was his pendulum bullshit, but he also lied about his results on gyroscopes. I guess where I'm going with this is there's a Navy video, and I've got it here, and I will actually also post this. Okay, so here's the Navy aviation training film. And what they say in this makes perfect logical sense for any gyro. And they say that because gyros maintain a rigidity in space, that you can change the orientation of the gimbals all around them that are attached to it, but the gyro will stay right there. So Foucault allegedly did an experiment where he and his cheesy 200-year-old gyro, supposedly, he was able to spin it up and actually see precession in the gyro, which would have indicated and proved motion, angular motion most specifically, brought about by the rotation of the Earth. Well, that's all fine and dandy, except that everybody that has performed this experiment since he's done it, and with far better equipment, has failed to get any results that even remotely come close to what Foucault claimed that he had. A good example, Rob Durham bought an extremely high-precision gyroscope, did the precession test. Guess what? He let it run for, quite a while, and he had calculated the precession based on his latitude, and of course the gyroscope did not move at all. There is another guy, Yeoman P., that here's his video, where he let it run for 6 hours, and it detected absolutely zero motion. Well, a lot of people came back, and their debunks was, well, the gyroscope simply was not sensitive enough to measure this movement of the Earth, which is, of course, ludicrous, because if Foucault could do it several hundred years ago with his cheesy gyroscopes, the notion that we couldn't replicate it today with high-end 21st century engineered gyroscopes, and also we have the advantage of motors, which will keep that gyro spinning continuously, and we still cannot duplicate it. That tells me that Foucault lied. It also tells me that if in our airplane, going back to my Cessna that I rented years ago when I was first getting my private pilot's license, that had a gyroscope in it that had to be calibrated on the ground. In other words, you cage the instrument while you are on the ground, and caging is simply nothing more than setting the azimuth into the gyroscope while it's calibrated on a level surface on the ground. And when you cage it, that's the last place that you calibrate your gyros. Once you take off, the gyros continuously run, and the only thing that you correct is heading due to magnetic declination. And this is something that's a routine practice for pilots. But the bottom line is that if there were any curvature at all, not only would the gyroscope detect it in an airplane, it would detect that ridiculous amount of curvature that I was talking about earlier, that you'd have to be compensating at the rate of 2,800 foot per minute in a standard jet airliner. But guess what? The gyroscope simply does not detect that. Why doesn't it detect it? Because there's no curvature to the Earth. End of story. There's so many things that prove this, and anybody that thinks that there is any modification going on to the gyroscopic mechanism itself that is modifying for the curvature of the Earth is deluded, and they simply have not done their homework and looked into these strange phenomena that everybody's touting called Schuler tuning, or the air discharge vanes at the bottom of the gyroscopic gimbal structure. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. Didn't exist 30 years ago when I got my pilot's license. You are never, ever trained to compensate for Coriolis, curvature of the Earth. You are never trained on the instruments. In fact, it is the very nature of the instruments to fight any sort of curvature or turning away from anything that is perfectly flat level. There are a million people that are going to come back with a million rebuttals to this, and I say bring them on, because whatever you bring back, I would suggest you really research it deeply. And then fine, if you find something that's great, present it to me. I will be happy to personally debate this with you, because for the last 3 weeks I've done nothing but research this. And I'm telling you, the gyroscopes, contrary to the people in the chat that are claiming that they prove the ball Earth, do anything but that. They prove the flat Earth. Not only do they prove the flat Earth, but they prove the motionless flat Earth. So any comments, guys?
It's a possibility.
So what does this prove? This proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that both it is the ether rotating at approximately 15 degrees per hour around the Earth, and that there is zero motion of the Earth around the sun. Okay, so if you guys are understanding this, remember, everybody that is measuring this with their fiber optic gyros, they're looking at that 15 degrees per hour and say, yep, there it is. That proves that the Earth is rotating. But what they're completely failing to take into consideration is all the other motions that are in play here that are considerably faster than the 1,038 mile per hour rotation. For example, the 66,000 or 67,000 mile per hour velocity around the sun around the Milky Way around the Great Attractor. In other words, all of these things are well within the sensitivity thresholds of these ring laser gyros, and yet the only thing they measure is the 15 degrees per hour rotation. And that does change, by the way, by the latitude, and that's calculated by the cosine of the latitude times, oh shit, I forgot. Anyway, it's calculable, okay? But the bottom line is no other motion is detected. And that, of course, is the one thing that the mainstream and all these people saying, oh, well, these fiber optic gyros and these ring laser gyros are conclusively measuring the rotation of the Earth, wrong again. It is not what's happening, because there would be several other velocities in there that would heavily skew those readings because of the velocities involved being highly, well into the threshold of detectability of the ring laser gyro. So the conclusion of all this is that a lot of you remember Mark Sargent reading the letter from the pilot that was talking about how the Adiru alignment calibration module unit had failed, and then he was told by air traffic control to essentially just go ahead and take off, and since he wasn't going out of radar range anywhere, that he could just check in and make manual adjustments manually. Well, to the pilot's surprise, there were never any adjustments to be made. It was always right on the money. And of course, the reason for that is because, again, it was not having to compensate for rotation of the Earth, but rather the heavens above. Therefore, it really didn't affect what was going on inside the cockpit. Now, that gets into a little bit more of a complex explanation, but and I will explain this at some point, but I think I've probably gone to my limit about people's attention span today. But all I wanted to do was point out that it is quite impossible that we would only be detecting one rotation of axis with the fiber optic or ring laser gyros when we have several other velocities going on. So that's it. Hopefully you guys understand it. If not, we'll try and elaborate on it more. But you know, it's conclusive, guys. Our own experiments tell us straight up that the ether is rotating around the Earth and that there is no tangential velocity around the sun. Period. End of story. Comments, you guys?
Let me close that for you.
In other words, whenever you have an electromagnetic rotation, you also have what's called a dielectric rotation. And the dielectric rotation is always at 90-degree perpendicular axis from every single point from the EM field itself. So you have this toroidal EM field, and no matter where you take a measurement or a sample of it, there will always be a 90-degree dielectric rotation. This is called counter space, okay? Now this is where, a lot of people have a hard time getting their head around this, and this is covered in electrical engineering, but it's basically this kind of, I guess you could look at it as kind of an alternate dimension, if you will, where the sun is actually drawing its energy from, is this counterspatial dielectric field. And remember what I told you guys about magnetic fields. All magnetic fields also have a dielectric component to them as well as an electrical component. We know that when a magnetic field cuts across a conductor, it induces a current flow of electricity. Conversely, there's also this dielectric field, which is the ether, which is the counterspatial force that's there. So we said, okay, so let's see if we can influence this alleged rotation of the Earth or the sky or whatever. And so we devised this experiment with this Helmholtz coil, with the idea being that if we can generate a magnetic field, we also know that that's going to affect the dielectric field as well. In fact, if we get enough power behind it and get it in close enough proximity, it will absolutely interfere with the dielectric or etheric field that the light itself is propagating through from the fiber optic gyro. So Rick built it, we hooked it up, fired it up, and lo and behold, as soon as we turned that Helmholtz coil on, the readings of 15 degrees per hour just went to heck. It just completely screwed with it. Well, that's a problem, because if we are able to affect it magnetically / dielectrically, then that tells us that it's not the motion of the Earth that's simply causing the phase change in the light, right? It's actually the dielectric field that we are influencing.
Let me close that for you.
Did the test, no precession. Rob Durham did this, in a multitude of ways, no precession. In other words, every time they cry about, oh, you didn't do this, or you did it wrong, or whatever, once again, they never, like Charles, oh, well, you just misunderstand it, or you did it wrong. When are you guys going to show us the right way to do it, where we're actually going to see these precession and these gyros? When are you going to show us your experiments instead of armchair quarterbacking? That's all you do. That's all you have, and name calling is all you have, and frankly, it gets a little old. That's why when we come out with these results that we're going to be hitting the universities directly and then the scientific community with these results, And, you know, somebody somewhere is going to look at it and listen and go, oh my God, you know, we're not appealing to the trolls. We already know what your function is, and we already know that either you are complete idiots or your cognitive dissonance is at such a high level that you'll never come out of the matrix, or you're simply being paid to try and debunk this. But you know what? Things like what I presented today are not debunkable. And not only that, it's been proven for over 100 years. And modern day technology is even proving more that there is no lateral motion around the sun, period. Yes, there is a rotational vector that's going around the Earth, but it is absolutely conclusively proven that it is coming from the heavens, the dielectric energy of the stars themselves, and not the Earth's rotation underneath them. So, you know, I'm sorry to go on this rant, but, you know, these trolls really piss me off sometimes because, you know, all they can do is armchair quarterback, tell us what we do wrong, and never, ever do they provide any conclusive evidence to the contrary. All they can do is post links about what NASA says or what the mainstream says, and they act like they're big smarty pantses because they found this and they can, you know, show it to us, you know, like it means something. You know what, guys? Give it up. We're actually looking for our own truth, and we're doing it the best way we know how with the resources that we have. And you know, I'm sorry, but we're ripping you a new one. You're losing this battle, and it's about time you rid yourself of cognitive dissonance and start, you know, smelling the coffee here.
How are you going to go into work tomorrow? How are you going to face the other science guys? How are you going to face yourself? Oh.
That was fun. So who's hungry?
I am.